"You locked the only engineer who could stop this crash out of the room," the voice echoed down the glass hallway, but by then the door had already sealed shut with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, like the quiet start of a much bigger problem, and Marcus Bennett stood there holding his tablet, calm, unreadable. As the frosted glass panel reflected the glow of red warning lights flickering across the operations floor behind him, inside the conference room executives leaned over polished oak tables, screens filled with graphs climbing too fast, latency numbers ticking upward, and Daniel Carter, Vice President of Technology, adjusted his cufflinks and didn't even glance toward the door he had just closed, because in his mind the decision had already been made. Marcus wasn't needed, not today, not for this crisis, not in this room. Marcus exhaled slowly, his posture relaxed, his expression steady, the way it always was when something serious was unfolding, and he stepped aside as two junior analysts hurried past him carrying laptops, one of them glancing back briefly, recognition flickering across his face before disappearing behind the conference room doors. The hallway lights hummed softly, the building's climate control whispered through vents, and somewhere on the operations floor a phone rang once, then again, then didn't stop. Marcus lowered his gaze to his tablet where system health indicators blinked amber, then red, then amber again, like a heartbeat struggling to stabilize. The numbers told a story no one inside that room was reading correctly: packet loss climbing, failover nodes hesitating, replication queues stretching beyond safe thresholds. Marcus leaned against the wall, not impatient, not frustrated, just observant, the same calm he carried during long overnight deployments. The same calm he carried years earlier when a supervisor once told him he was too quiet to lead a major architecture redesign, and yet here he was now, watching the infrastructure he had built begin to strain under pressure. Inside the room Daniel Carter spoke confidently, gesturing at the central display. "We've handled outages before," he said, his tone measured, controlled, certain. The executives nodded, relieved by confidence more than facts. One screen flickered, then stabilized, another displayed a warning message briefly before clearing. No one noticed except a junior engineer seated near the far end of the table, Ethan Miller, who glanced toward the door, then back to the screen, then toward the door again. Marcus shifted slightly, resting his tablet against his forearm. Still quiet, still waiting. The red indicator pulsed again, this time longer, this time deeper, and across the floor more phones began to ring, a low murmur building like distant thunder. Marcus watched the reflection of those flashing lights ripple across the glass, and in that moment the system latency jumped again, higher than before, dangerously close to the threshold he had warned about weeks earlier. The hallway clock ticked forward, second by second, and Marcus Bennett didn't knock, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood outside the crisis meeting he should have been leading, calm as the numbers climbed, because he knew something they didn't yet understand. And when the system built on millions of lines of code began to falter, when automated recovery scripts hesitated, when redundancy paths started to loop, there would only be one person who knew exactly where the architecture bent instead of broke, and that person was standing quietly in the hallway, locked out, watching the system begin to slip without him. The red indicator on Marcus Bennett's tablet pulsed again, slower this time, heavier, like the system itself was struggling to breathe, and across the operations floor more analysts leaned toward their monitors, whispering quietly as error notifications multiplied. The usual calm hum of the office had shifted into something tighter, something uncertain. Marcus remained still, his eyes scanning the cascading metrics. Replication delay now exceeding safe limits, database clusters hesitating between nodes, automated recovery scripts triggering but not completing, each warning subtle on its own but together forming a pattern he recognized instantly. Inside the conference room Daniel Carter paced slowly behind the chairs, pointing at charts projected onto a wall-sized display. "Traffic spike is stabilizing," he said, confident, deliberate, and several executives nodded, relieved by the tone more than the data. But Ethan Miller's eyes stayed locked on the lower corner of the screen where a small red banner appeared and disappeared too quickly for most people to notice. He leaned closer, adjusting his glasses. The latency number jumped again, higher than before, and he shifted in his seat, glancing toward the closed door, the hallway beyond silent except for distant ringing phones. Marcus tilted his head slightly as his tablet vibrated once, a system notification he had configured months earlier, failover delay exceeding 30 seconds, that threshold was never supposed to be reached. not unless multiple redundancies were failing at once. He tapped the screen, scrolling through node status reports. His expression unchanged but his attention sharpening. One of the backup clusters in Phoenix had stalled, another in Northern Virginia was attempting to compensate, but the load balancing logic was looping instead of distributing correctly. Marcus had seen this scenario once before during a late-night stress test when he was the only one left in the building, and he remembered exactly how fragile the recovery path could become. Inside the conference room, Daniel stopped pacing. "We are fine," he said again, more firmly this time, but his words were interrupted by a quiet chime from the central system console. One of the executives frowned. "What was that?" she asked, and Daniel waved a hand dismissively. "Just automated failover," he replied, but Ethan knew that sound. It meant something had not switched cleanly. He swallowed, then finally spoke. "Should we bring Marcus in?" he asked carefully. The room shifted slightly, a few heads turned, Daniel's jaw tightened. "We have senior engineers here," he answered. His tone controlled but colder now. Ethan nodded slowly, but his eyes drifted back to the numbers climbing again. Outside, Marcus shifted his weight slightly, the hallway lights reflecting off the polished floor. His tablet vibrated again, replication queue exceeding maximum tolerance. The building's clock ticked forward, and across the operations floor the murmur grew louder as more alerts appeared. Someone whispered that client dashboards were slowing, another analyst said transaction confirmations were lagging. Marcus watched the pattern unfold like a story he had already read, and though he did not move toward the door, he knew the system was approaching the edge where small delays became cascading failures. And inside the conference room, Daniel Carter straightened his jacket, unaware that the quiet stability he believed in was already beginning to fracture beneath the surface, while Marcus Bennett stood calmly in the hallway, the only person who understood exactly how close the system was to slipping beyond their control. The next alert did not flicker. It stayed solid and bright across Marcus Bennett's tablet, and at the same moment a low murmur swept across the operations floor as multiple dashboards shifted from amber to red. One analyst leaned forward whispering that transaction processing time had doubled. Another said authentication requests were stacking faster than they could clear. The sound of keyboards increased, steady and urgent, but still controlled, because no one wanted to be the first to say what they were starting to suspect. Marcus watched the data flow across his screen, replication queues now exceeding 5 minutes, failover nodes attempting to reroute traffic but failing to confirm stability. He tapped into a deeper diagnostic panel and saw the pattern forming exactly where he expected. The routing logic was cycling between two backup clusters, neither one accepting full load, each one pushing traffic back into the system like a loop that slowly tightened. Inside the conference room, Daniel Carter leaned forward over the table, his voice steady but slightly sharper now. "We are seeing increased load, but the redundancy architecture will absorb it," he said. One executive asked how long stabilization would take. Daniel replied confidently, "A few minutes at most," but the screen behind him updated again, latency numbers climbing past thresholds that were never supposed to be crossed. Ethan Miller shifted in his chair again, his eyes scanning the metrics faster now. He recognized the same pattern Marcus had explained during a training session months earlier, when Marcus had stood quietly at the front of a small conference room and said that redundancy systems were strong but not invincible, that certain rare conditions could create loops instead of recovery. Ethan remembered that explanation now, and his gaze moved toward the closed door again, the hallway beyond silent. Marcus's tablet vibrated twice. In quick succession, another alert, then another. He scrolled through logs, confirming what he already suspected: node synchronization failing in 2 regions, backup cache saturating, automated scripts retrying too aggressively, each attempt making the delay worse. Across the operations floor, a supervisor walked quickly between desks asking for status updates. Voices rose slightly but remained professional. Someone mentioned that external client dashboards were beginning to lag. Another analyst said login queues were forming. Marcus remained still, calm, observing, as the system he built began to strain under pressure. Inside the conference room, Daniel stopped speaking mid-sentence as a quiet tone sounded from the central console again, this time longer, more persistent. An executive frowned. "That does not sound minor," she said. Daniel hesitated for the first time, then replied, "It is still within recovery range." But the screen updated again, and the numbers did not stabilize. They climbed. Ethan finally spoke again, quieter this time but firmer. "Marcus designed the failover routing," he said. The room shifted, a few executives exchanged glances. Daniel looked toward Ethan, his expression controlled but tense. "We have capable engineers here," he answered, but his voice no longer carried the same certainty. Outside, Marcus Bennett watched as the replication delay crossed 7 minutes. A threshold that meant cascading slowdowns were already in motion. He knew what would happen next. Client systems would begin timing out, queued operations would multiply, and the recovery path would narrow with every passing second. The hallway clock ticked forward, and Marcus remained calm, knowing that the moment when the system stopped bending and started breaking was no longer minutes away, it was already beginning. The next shift was subtle at first but impossible to ignore as several monitors across the operations floor updated at the same time, dashboards refreshing slower than before, cursor movements lagging by fractions of a second that stretched into full seconds, and one analyst leaned back in his chair whispering that client response times had crossed 10 seconds. Another voice followed saying payment confirmations were queuing. Marcus Bennett watched the numbers rise steadily, not chaotic yet but moving in a direction he recognized too well. He opened another diagnostic layer and confirmed the failover routing loop was tightening, traffic cycling between backup clusters instead of stabilizing. Inside the conference room the air changed as executives leaned closer to their screens. Daniel Carter stood still now, no longer pacing, his eyes fixed on the metrics that refused to flatten. "What is our recovery timeline?" one executive asked, her voice calm but edged with concern. Daniel hesitated for half a second before answering. "We are still within operational tolerance," but the numbers behind him told a different story as transaction delay crossed 12 seconds and climbing. Ethan Miller leaned forward again, his fingers hovering above his keyboard as he scanned system logs from his seat. He recognized the routing pattern Marcus had once described during a quiet afternoon training session when only a handful of engineers had attended. Marcus had said that certain traffic loops could slowly starve the system of its own recovery capacity. Ethan swallowed as he watched the logs confirm that exact scenario unfolding. He glanced toward the door again, the hallway still visible through the glass panel, Marcus standing calmly outside, tablet in hand, observing. Ethan finally spoke again, louder this time. "Marcus built the routing logic," he said, and the room shifted more noticeably. A few executives exchanged glances. Daniel turned toward Ethan, his expression composed but tighter than before. "We have senior engineers present," he replied, but his voice lacked the confidence it carried minutes earlier. Across the operations floor more phones rang. One supervisor moved quickly between desks asking for status. Another analyst reported that several external partners had begun calling about delayed responses. Marcus scrolled through additional metrics. Node synchronization now failing in 3 regions. Retry attempts increasing load instead of relieving it. He knew the tipping point was approaching, the moment when queued operations multiplied faster than the system could process them. Inside the conference room a new alert appeared on the central display, not flashing but steady and bold. One executive leaned forward reading it aloud. "Queue saturation warning." The words hung in the air. Daniel stepped closer to the screen, his posture stiffening. Ethan watched quietly, then said one more time, softer but unmistakable, "He warned about this." And this time no one dismissed the comment immediately. The room fell briefly silent except for the quiet hum of electronics and distant ringing phones. Outside Marcus Bennett remained calm, watching the system edge closer to the point where recovery would require more than automated scripts, and the hallway clock ticked forward as the gap between control and collapse narrowed with every passing second. The first true break did not arrive with a loud alarm but with silence as several dashboards across the operations floor froze for 2 full seconds before refreshing all at once, and when they did the numbers jumped sharply. Transaction queues doubled, authentication delays stretched past 15 seconds, and one analyst leaned forward whispering that external clients were reporting timeouts. Another voice followed saying that internal services were beginning to retry automatically, which only added more traffic to an already strained system. Marcus Bennett watched the pattern unfold exactly as he expected. The loop between backup clusters had now begun to choke the recovery path. He tapped into deeper logs and confirmed that retry attempts were multiplying faster than the system could process them, a classic cascade beginning quietly but accelerating. With every passing second, inside the conference room Daniel Carter stood motionless staring at the central display, his earlier confidence replaced with a controlled tension. "Why are the retries increasing?" one executive asked. her voice steady but concerned. Daniel answered quickly, "The system is compensating," but even as he spoke another alert appeared, Q saturation exceeding safe limits. Ethan Miller shifted in his seat, scrolling through logs from his laptop. He recognized the escalation curve Marcus had once demonstrated during a simulation, a curve that started slow and then rose sharply once the system crossed a certain threshold. Ethan looked toward the door again, seeing Marcus still standing calmly outside, and something about that calm contrasted sharply with the rising urgency inside the room. Across the operations floor phones rang continuously now. A supervisor walked quickly between desks gathering updates. Another analyst reported that payment processing delays had reached 20 seconds. Marcus scrolled through node synchronization reports, 3 regions now out of alignment, retry scripts triggering repeatedly, each attempt adding more strain. He knew that once the backlog reached critical mass the system would no longer recover on its own. Inside the conference room a new alert appeared in bold text across the display, "Service degradation expanding." One executive leaned forward reading the message aloud. Daniel stepped closer to the screen. His posture tightening, Ethan finally spoke again, this time without hesitation. He warned about cascading retries, he said. The room fell quiet, and for the first time no one dismissed the statement. Daniel glanced toward the door briefly, then back to the screen, still resisting the implication. Outside Marcus Bennett's tablet vibrated repeatedly now, alerts stacking faster than before. He watched calmly as the system crossed another threshold, transaction queue surpassing safe recovery limits. The building's clock ticked forward, and the quiet confidence that had filled the conference room minutes earlier was replaced with a growing realization that the system was no longer stabilizing, it was slipping, and Marcus Bennett remained outside the room, the one person who knew exactly how to stop the cascade before it spread further. The tipping point arrived quietly but unmistakably as the operations floor lights reflected off screens now filled with red warnings, transaction delays crossing 30 seconds, retry attempts multiplying faster than analysts could track them, and one supervisor spoke into a headset confirming that several enterprise clients were reporting system outages. Marcus Bennett watched the cascading metrics scroll across his tablet. The failover loop tightening, backup clusters saturated. Synchronization between regions failing completely. He tapped into a deeper diagnostic panel and confirmed what he had expected. Automated recovery scripts were now competing against each other, each one trying to fix the same bottleneck, each attempt increasing the load. Inside the conference room Daniel Carter leaned forward over the table, no longer pacing, his voice controlled but noticeably tense. "Why are the queues still increasing?" he asked one of the senior engineers. The engineer shook his head slightly while scanning logs. "Retries are compounding," he answered quietly, and another alert appeared across the display, "Service timeout expanding." One executive exhaled slowly. "How long before this affects all clients?" she asked. Daniel hesitated before answering. "We are working to stabilize," but the screen behind him updated again, and the delay climbed past 35 seconds. Ethan Miller looked down at his laptop, then back at the display, then toward the door. Marcus still standing outside, calm, observing. Ethan finally spoke again, louder now. "He built the retry logic," he said, and this time the room did not dismiss the statement. Silence settled for a brief moment, broken only by the sound of distant ringing phones. Across the operations floor analysts moved faster now. One reported that authentication services were timing out, another said dashboard access was intermittent. Marcus scrolled through additional logs, confirming node failures spreading across multiple regions. He knew the cascade was now in motion. Once the backlog reached critical mass, even restored nodes would struggle to catch up. Inside the conference room Daniel glanced toward the door for the first time, just a brief look, then back to the display, still resisting the conclusion. Another alert appeared, transaction queue exceeding recovery threshold. One executive leaned back in her chair. "This is spreading," she said quietly, the words hanging in the air. Marcus's tablet vibrated repeatedly now, alerts stacking faster than before. He watched calmly, the same composure he carried during late-night deployments when systems faltered and teams panicked. He knew the architecture, he knew the pressure points, and he knew exactly where to intervene before the cascade became irreversible. The hallway clock ticked forward, and inside the conference room Daniel Carter finally exhaled slowly as the numbers refused to stabilize, while Marcus Bennett remained outside, the only engineer who understood how to stop the collapse that was now unfolding across the entire system. The silence inside the conference room felt heavier than the alarms outside as the central display refreshed again and transaction delays crossed 40 seconds, a number that shifted the tone of the room from concern to urgency. Daniel Carter leaned forward with both hands on the table, his voice lower now, controlled but strained. Status, he asked, and the senior engineer beside him answered quietly. Retry loops are spreading across regions. Another alert appeared, authentication service. Degradation expanding. One executive checked her phone and looked up. Clients are already calling, she said, and the words seemed to settle across the room like a realization no one wanted to acknowledge. Ethan Miller watched the metrics rise, then glanced again toward the glass door. Marcus Bennett still standing calmly outside, tablet in hand, observing. Ethan spoke once more. He designed the failover hierarchy, he said. And this time several executives turned toward Daniel, waiting. Daniel's jaw tightened, and before he could answer a phone on the table vibrated sharply. The caller ID displayed executive leadership. Daniel hesitated for a brief second before answering. Daniel Carter, he said, listening as the voice on the other end spoke quickly. His expression changed, subtle but unmistakable. We are aware, he replied, then paused, listening again. His eyes flicked toward the door. Yes, he said quietly, then ended the call. The room watched him, waiting. He exhaled slowly. That was the chief technology officer, he said, his voice measured but no longer confident. They are asking who is leading the architecture response. The silence deepened. Ethan glanced toward the door again, then back to Daniel, and another phone vibrated, this time from the central console. Daniel answered, listening briefly, then nodding once. Understood, he said before ending the call. One executive leaned forward. What did they say? Daniel paused, then answered. They asked where Marcus Bennett is. The words hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. The central display updated again. Transaction queues rising, retry loops expanding. Outside Marcus's tablet vibrated repeatedly, alerts stacking faster than before. He watched calmly, the same composure he carried during system migrations and overnight deployments. Inside the conference room Daniel glanced toward the door again, longer this time, and the weight of the moment settled over the room as the realization formed. The system was no longer stabilizing, and the engineer who built the architecture was standing just outside, waiting, calm, while the cascade continued to spread. Daniel Carter stood still for a moment after the call ended, the quiet in the room now heavier than the alerts flashing across the central display. Transaction delays crossing 50 seconds, retry loops expanding across every major region, and one executive leaned forward reading another alert as it appeared. Service availability degraded. The words settled into the room like confirmation of what everyone already felt. Daniel finally moved, his posture no longer confident but urgent. He turned toward the glass door, his eyes locking on Marcus Bennett standing calmly in the hallway, tablet in hand, observing. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Inside the room tension tightened while outside Marcus remained steady, composed, watching the cascade unfold. Daniel walked toward the door, each step measured but quick, the room watching silently as he reached for the handle and opened it. The hallway air felt quieter than the conference room, almost still. Marcus looked up calmly, his expression unchanged. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. Marcus, he said, his voice lower than before. Controlled but no longer dismissive. We need you inside. Marcus nodded. Once, not rushed, not surprised, he stepped forward as Daniel moved aside, and together they entered the conference room. The shift in the room was immediate. Several executives turned toward Marcus, some recognizing him, others simply sensing the change. The central display updated again, transaction queues climbing, retry loops spreading. Marcus walked to the table and set his tablet down, his eyes scanning the display quickly, absorbing the metrics in seconds. Ethan Miller leaned back slightly, relief visible in his posture. Marcus spoke calmly. Replication loops between Phoenix and Northern Virginia, he said, his tone steady, precise. Retry scripts are amplifying load. The senior engineers looked at each other. One nodded slowly. Marcus continued, we need to isolate one region and reset failover hierarchy. Daniel listened silently, the authority in the room shifting without announcement. Marcus tapped his tablet, pulling up a deeper architecture map. Queue saturation is approaching irreversible backlog, he added, pointing at the screen. One executive asked quietly, can we stabilize? Marcus looked at the metrics again, calm as ever. Yes, he answered, but we need to act now. The room fell silent as the numbers continued climbing, and for the first time since the crisis began the tension shifted from uncertainty to focused urgency. Because the engineer who built the system was no longer outside the room, he was standing at the center of it, calmly guiding the response as the cascade continued to spread across the infrastructure. Marcus Bennett's fingers moved calmly across his tablet as the central display continued to refresh, transaction delays now pushing past 60 seconds, retry loops spreading across secondary services, and the room watched in silence as he studied the architecture map, his voice steady, measured. Disable retry amplification on Phoenix cluster, he said. One senior engineer nodded and moved quickly, typing commands into the console. Marcus continued without raising his voice. Shift primary routing to Northern Virginia but throttle inbound traffic to prevent backlog overflow. Another engineer followed, the room now moving in coordinated urgency. Daniel Carter stepped slightly aside, no longer leading, simply listening. Marcus tapped another section of the display. Authentication services are choking on queue saturation, he said. Temporarily isolate non-critical requests. A supervisor relayed the instruction to the operations floor. Within seconds analysts began implementing the adjustments. The central display refreshed again, numbers still high but no longer climbing as sharply. One executive leaned forward, watching closely. Is that stabilization? She asked quietly. Marcus glanced at the metrics, calm as ever. We are slowing the cascade, he replied. Now we rebuild the recovery path. The room remained silent except for keyboards and distant phone calls. Marcus opened another diagnostic layer. Resynchronize Northern Virginia with Dallas fallback node, he instructed. Another engineer executed the command. Seconds passed, the numbers flickered, then shifted. Transaction delays stopped climbing, holding steady for the first time since the crisis began. Ethan Miller exhaled slowly, relief spreading across his face. Marcus continued. Gradually release throttling, he said. Do not rush it. The engineers followed carefully, and slowly the numbers began to drop. 50 seconds, then 45, then 40. The room leaned closer to the display as the cascade reversed. The operations floor noise softened slightly as alerts stopped multiplying. Marcus watched calmly, ensuring stability before speaking again. Recovery is underway, he said, his tone steady. The central display refreshed once more, transaction queues shrinking, retry loops clearing, synchronization returning across regions. One executive leaned back, the tension in her shoulders easing. Daniel Carter watched silently, the weight of the moment settling over him. Marcus stepped back slightly from the table, his work nearly complete, and as the system stabilized further he spoke one final time, his voice calm, measured, and unmistakably clear. Systems built to handle pressure still depend on the people who understand them. The room remained quiet as the numbers continued to fall, stability returning across the infrastructure. The cascade halted, the recovery complete, and Marcus Bennett stood calmly at the center of the room, the engineer who had turned a collapse into control without raising his voice, without rushing, simply by knowing exactly where the system needed him most.